Hello and welcome to Kubernetes Management, Opportunities and Challenges. I'm your host today, Mike Vizard, and we have three outstanding panelists, but let's get to some housekeeping notes before we introduce those folks. First of all, I'm going to draw your attention to the chat button. If you want to kick in on the chat session, by all means, just click on that and start chatting away. There's also a Q&A button. We encourage you to ask questions during the webinar. We will try to address those during the webinar as opposed to waiting for the end. But if we don't get to them all, somebody will get back to you most certainly. Our presenters today are Kendall Miller, who's president of Fairwinds, a provider of managed services and a contributor to a number of open source projects in the containers and Kubernetes space. Then we have Ron Riebenzoft, who's the CTO for Epsagon, which is a provider of an observability platform. And finally, we have Jimmy Alvarez, who's a product marketing manager for Red Hat. One last thing, we will be giving away some Amazon gift cards today, so make sure you stick around to the very end. Let's get started and jump in with a question aimed at Jimmy first. I feel like we're on this extended journey when it comes to Kubernetes, and if I look at it, it's starting to feel like a very long caravan. There's people all the way at the back of the caravan. They have maybe one cluster, maybe two, and it's in an app dev environment. And then on the other side, at the very front, we have folks who are managing fleets of Kubernetes clusters. What is your sense of where are we on this journey as an industry? And, do we have a lot of clusters that people are managing yet, or does everybody still have two, but their bulk of what they're managing is outside of Kubernetes?
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate the introduction. And hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. So yeah, great question. Absolutely. I think, we are kind of in the middle of the road right now. Considering that you will find customers that have two clusters to customers that have over 100 clusters, right? They all do it in a very different way. Some are mostly worried about being able to manage their Kubernetes clusters, right, that might be on-prem. Some are managing Kubernetes clusters only on public clouds. Some want to be able to do it together, right? And that's where I think the challenge kind of comes when you're trying to kind of manage everything within a single pane of glass, that's spread across multiple different clouds. It can be quite complicated and quite cumbersome. I think whatever you might have two clusters or whatever you might have 100, you do need to find a way to centralize your management of your clusters, because otherwise it does not become something that can be repeatable, especially if you want to provide a platform for your developers to build on.
All right. Kendall, do you want to add to that? Because you see a lot of Kubernetes clusters as a managed service provider, I would assume, but is there at some point a tipping point maybe where people go, I can't do this on my own anymore? What drives?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I think we're right at the beginning of Kubernetes adoption. I think Kubernetes is going to be as instrumental in changing the cloud landscape as Linux was in changing the server landscape. Linux became fundamental to servers everywhere. Yes, there's always going to be people running Windows Server or Exchange Server or whatever, but Linux has become the default, and I think Kubernetes is on the way to doing the same thing for orchestrating compute in the cloud. And I think that we're going to see a hockey stick of that, and we're right at the very beginning of that lift. I think it's, there's still a long ways for this journey to go for Kubernetes. So like, where are we in the life cycle? Right at the very beginning. We can tell it's picking up, but we're not anywhere near getting close to the top of that hockey stick yet. That's my opinion. Where do folks need help with that? I mean, everywhere along the way, but 5 years ago, people were paying for help because just standing Kubernetes up was really, really, really difficult. It's increasingly not the problem anymore. I can go into Google, click a button and get a GKE cluster, or the same on any of the clouds. The problem is, how many clusters should I have? How do I separate them? What should I run in Kubernetes? What shouldn't I? How do I change my app to deploy into that? So there's a million questions still there. But click button, get Kubernetes was the problem 5 years ago, and it's not really a problem anymore.
Ron, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, actually adding to Kendall, that really resonates with what I'm seeing on field. Tooling and platforms is the key thing to increase the adoption. 5 years ago, when we needed to deploy a Kubernetes instance, not much documentation, no tooling at all. When we needed to scale this, security, observability, monitoring, logging, everything was almost, random or each one to himself. And now there is a lot of tooling around each and every ecosystem. Still needs to be much improved over the time. But I think I agree with all. We were at the beginning phases for full adoption.
Well,
and this reminds me just real quick to add to all of that, because I think this is a great subject, right? So one of the things that this reminds me of is virtualization technology, right? So I worked for a major virtualization company for a very long time, and I remember the ramp up of virtualization, just like the ramp up of Kubernetes. So I feel like I agree with you, Kendall. We are right at the cusp of the breakup point to go into full adoption, given that, again, I've seen the adoption for virtualization, and now I've seen the switch into Kubernetes world. It's the same thing. Management still becomes an issue, whatever, you have 1, 20, or 100.
All right. Ron, I want to follow up on that comment you made, because you could argue then that Kubernetes may be suffering a bad rap to its reputation, because the perception is that it's extremely difficult. It's recognized as being most powerful, but have we kind of moved past that point where, mere mortal IT administrators can manage this, or do I still need somebody who has site reliability engineering skills, and we're assuming that that's what people have, or how generalist are we?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think we all passed the notion of what is Kubernetes, how do I deploy this, how do I maintain it at a very basic level. But that's not the point of Kubernetes. You don't deploy Kubernetes for one service or two services. You really want to do that for deploying, a full stack app, tens of services, really running, very distributed workload. And this is the point of the problem. As more you grow and scale within your cluster/clusters, and namespaces and pods and nodes and so on, this is where it's getting harder, and that's where you need an SRE to actually observe the whole ecosystem, not just, by the way, the Kubernetes, also the underlying application and what it's doing. But that's where you need someone to really operationalize your whole ecosystem running on Kubernetes, and that's where it's also a DevOps to maintain CI/CD and flows to that Kubernetes cluster, and logging solution and metric solution and security and service mesh. And this is where it comes really hard. But the notion of setting up a Kubernetes for the beginning hard, we passed that. Now it's how do I handle hundreds of services live?
Yeah, I would add to that it's, in my opinion, very similar to the move back to the Linux analogy, right? When Linux first comes out, if all you've ever used is Windows, does Linux seem incredibly complicated? Yes, but it's not that Linux is complicated. It's just that all the paradigms are different. And so it's the same thing with Kubernetes. It's not that Kubernetes is more complicated than anything else we're using. In fact, writing piles and piles of configuration management tooling, be that Ansible or something else, is just as complicated. It's just a different paradigm. And so now you've moved to this new world, and until you learn the new paradigm, it's really overwhelming. So does it have a bad rap as being extremely hard? Yeah, but that's just because the inertia involved in that pivot is really big. I mean, the reason that we have major Linux nerds, Linux sysadmins that really gate kept a lot of Linux for a long, long time is because it was a new paradigm. But once people became familiar with it and Linux became more boring and more common, the average developer now feels very comfortable using a Linux machine, even on their desktop. And it's going to be the same way with Kubernetes. Do you need an SRE? Sure, right now, because it's still new. But somebody who's been swimming in this water for a while, it just starts to feel like water. And I think we're going to see, to your point, Mike, we are a managed service provider, and lots of people hire us to solve these problems because they're hard. But we also develop software around this to just expose how to do it, because increasingly people don't want to have to pay for a person. They just want a tool to show them, am I doing this right? And I think that we'll see more of that kind of thing proliferate.
Jimmy, let me follow up with you on that. I think part of the issue is not just Kubernetes itself, it's all the stuff that we have to wrap around it to make it run. It's Prometheus and all this other materials that people are trying to stitch together. Is that going to get easier? I mean, are we going to see these kinds of integrated suites of things that sit on top of Kubernetes? And is that how we're going to go forward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, if you look at the Kubernetes community, right, there is multiple different open source projects that exist today. You mentioned a few. You mentioned Prometheus, Tannis, right? There are, Hive, right? There are so many different projects out there that right now I think we are in this phase of where we're kind of sorting through the different projects, right? And there are tools that are wrapping around some of these projects and kind of simplifying it, right? To kind of go back to your initial statement around systems administrator, just your normal run-of-the-mill system administrator being able to run a Kubernetes environment at a scale. While that's not, I believe, 100% true just yet, we are getting there because we are building tools. There are tools that will put all of these kind of open source available, resources and simplifying them into one tool. Because it can be complicated, right? Which open source project do you pick? There are 10 different ones to be able to provision a Kubernetes cluster. While you can do it with just one click of a button, it's still which one do you pick for later on, right? Which one has the most community support? Which one has, the most developers working on it? It can be a little bit challenging. So you just got to be very careful when you are working and looking at different solutions to be able to manage your Kubernetes environments and see and find the ones that are using the most active projects. Because again, there are a lot of projects out there that are not quite as active as some of them, right?
Right. Kendall, do you think that it has emerged with any clarity as to what are the actual benefits of switching over to Kubernetes? When you talk to customers, what's driving it? Because sometimes, I feel like IT is a little bit of a fashion industry, right? It's the cool thing of the day, and everybody wants to go build something that, looks good on their resume, but there's an ROI conversation to be had somewhere. What's driving that?
Resume-driven development, RDD. I actually just Friday had a call from a very large e-commerce site that is wanting to make the shift to Kubernetes. And they called to say, hey, we need help making this business case. And I think there's a number of things there. First of all, most companies, before they get to Kubernetes, are using something like a PaaS, right? Like a platform as a service. And click button, get infrastructure is a really nice place to be for as long as you can live there. And if something that's out of the box just works for you, just use that and use it forever. But at some point, a company is big enough that they need more fine-grained control over how some of the internal networking is happening, how the different services are moving around and scaling, and they need that fine-grained control that you can do with other tools, such as, say, ECS or Docker Swarm. But the reason when you're getting to the point where you're choosing between these different tools, the reason people land on Kubernetes is the speed at which the project's moving. This particular customer was saying ECS just can't keep up. Right now, it's starting to fall behind Kubernetes, but it's obvious it's going to continue to do so. And we need that community support. And I hate to compare it now to WordPress, but because WordPress has all of its own problems in terms of security, et cetera. But the reason marketing teams choose WordPress is everyone uses WordPress. And so there is a plugin out there. If you run into a unique problem, somebody else has already solved it. And it's the same thing with a recent customer of ours that's moving off of Nomad. They're like, Nomad's great, as long as your use case is exactly what Nomad does. The moment you need to extend it, we're the only company that's ever run into this problem. There is no such thing as an extension for this. Nobody has ever, because there isn't the community support. So community support is a big part of the reason, that fine-grained control. And then the other thing is just when you're moving off a PaaS, at some point the PaaS becomes cost prohibitive, and having more control over everything underneath yourself makes sense. Those are the main business reasons that I see people move to Kubernetes, in addition to, let's be honest, resume-driven development is part of it. And but the juice is worth the squeeze. Just because there's buzz around something doesn't mean that it's not worth it,
Yeah, I also seen some organizations moving to Kubernetes. Obviously, what you mentioned is the top top reasons to move to Kubernetes, but also due to multi-cloud strategy or portability strategy. Then Kubernetes is already managed by literally every cloud vendor, and even if you want to manage it on your own, or have a hybrid kind of application both on-prem and cloud. So that's one of more strategic points that driving organizations to Kubernetes.
Jimmy, are you seeing that? Because I would argue that a lot of what we're calling hybrid cloud might just be multiple clouds that people have, and they're backing their way into that. They got a couple of development teams that spun up a couple of different platforms here and there, and then they got around to kind of managing it, maybe with consoles for each one, but they haven't gotten to the point where they're unifying the management of all that under a single console. So where are we on this hybrid cloud adventure?
Yeah, I have definitely seen a lot of that. And besides the tooling itself, one of the biggest things that sometimes we kind of forget to talk about is the cultural change. There needs to be within the organization also a cultural change when it comes to managing some of these Kubernetes clusters, right? There are many different terms, many different aspects of managing it, right? Everything from having your infrastructure team provision them, to having your developers kind of deploy applications in a CI/CD pipeline, right? To having your security team make sure that those clusters are secure, right, to go into production. So there are many challenges besides just the tooling, right? I just wanted to make sure it's clear that even with the best tool in the world, you still will struggle if you don't have any processes that kind of wrap around that tooling that you will implement. I think it's important that, while looking at those tools, that you also clearly have an understanding within your organization as to who are the key players in the different departments, and making sure that all of them are interconnected and speaking to each other, because otherwise, you can have, again, the best tool in the world and it just won't help. We are definitely seeing a huge increase on being able to manage hybrid clouds. So your on-prem versus your public cloud solutions, right? Most organizations think that just because you can go and click and deploy a Kubernetes cluster in a public cloud, that is it. You already have your Kubernetes clusters. Now I can start developing applications. Unfortunately, you quickly realize that that doesn't scale out. There is security concerns. There is locational concerns when it comes to your applications and who you're going to be serving these applications to. So there are many challenges that you have to think through from end to end when you're thinking management of Kubernetes.
Okay. Kendall, you want to jump in there? Because I feel like I'm not sure what's the chicken and the egg here. Did the tools come first and then the process, or does the process come first and then we find the tools?
Well, we'll order both off of Amazon and see which one arrives first and let you know. I think that the hybrid cloud thing, like to go back and address some of that, I think that the idea of what hybrid cloud looks like with Kubernetes has changed a lot over the last few years. When Kubernetes first came out, people were like, hey, we're going to be able to federate across clouds, have one control plane across lots of different clouds. And technically that's possible, but it's still kind of a bad idea. The beauty of Kubernetes is you can have Kubernetes running in AWS and have it running in Google and have it running in Azure and have it running in your data center. And standing it up is different in each of those locations, but once it's stood up, the management of it does look a lot the same. Now, you can't wipe everything away because it's sort of like putting a 747 control panel in a small Cessna airplane. Like at some point you're losing the best of what you've got, and you need to be able to take advantage of what's under the hood. So it's the hybrid clouds that I am seeing are actually people running separate workloads in different places or replicating workloads in different places more than I'm seeing, trying to cross the boundaries or store certain things in certain places and certain things in others. But as for the tools, is the tool going to get there first? I think people have a business problem that they go to solve. And that business problem might be, we acquired a company who was operating in Google on GKE and all of our infrastructures in AWS. So how do we land on a platform that makes sense? Well, if we move off of ECS into Kubernetes, now we have 2 Kubernetes environments rather than trying to move this one from Google into Amazon, which is also going to be a different kind of heavy lift. But by centralizing on Kubernetes, okay, we can go solve that. That's the business case that drives us to what are the tools that we're going to use to then manage that. And there's things out there like Anthos from Google, right? So that you can click button, have GKE cluster anywhere. And it seems like a very Googly solution to me. Like, it's a really impressive engineering solution for a problem very few people have. Actually having that centralized control plane across everything is less important than having a uniform way to manage these clusters, a uniform way to deploy into these clusters wherever they're running. And by it being Kubernetes underneath, you can centralize on those things. You can have the same CI tool, even if it's pointing to different clouds or a different data center. I don't know. I'm going in circles a little bit there, but Jimmy, you work for Red Hat, so you can probably correct me.
No, you're absolutely correct. And I see a question that came in through the Q&A that is kind of relevant to this discussion, right? So I'll go ahead and read the question just so everybody can see it, because I think it's an important point to address. So it says, a problem for a lot of companies. Oh, and the question just went away.
Oh, I hit publish so that everybody could see it. So it's over in the publish tab there, Jimmy. Sorry.
Oh, I see it. Yeah, no, that's fine. A problem for a lot of companies is that they don't want to give the control of their infrastructure to just one cloud provider. Have you seen deployment where the company that has its control plane locally, for example, and deployed to multiple cloud vendors seamlessly without delegating all the control to one cloud provider in particular? This is a great question that we get asked quite often, especially me being part of Red Hat. There is a big interest on that, right? To be able to manage your whatever you might have. Cloud provision Kubernetes clusters, and you want to manage them locally rather than having to go to a portal and manage it that way. And we at Red Hat provide several solutions for that, right? But yes, we absolutely have seen this. We have seen it in the telco space. The telco space is huge for that because they don't necessarily want to have a solution that is perhaps for a 5G tower that they need to have. They don't want that to be connected to, and having to do a management in a remote site. They want to do the management right on point. Same, we have seen it with financial institutions. Financial institutions has been also an absolute place where we've seen that they don't necessarily want to. They want to have some of the workloads up there, but they don't necessarily want the management in prem, right? So we at Red Hat have several solutions to kind of help you through that. We have, multiple management tools that allow you to kind of go through and have your on-prem management of your Kubernetes clusters, regardless. They might be on a cloud, or they might be on your on-prem, or even a disconnected environment. So,
all right. Hey, Ron, I want to ask you a follow-up question on that, but you would have to turn off your. There you go.
Yeah.
If I think back in time, a decade ago, we made 2 promises to the world. One is we would have flying cars, and the other one was that IT would be easy. So what happened along this journey? And, you guys are a specialist now in this observability, and we hear this buzzword all the time, but it's not clear to me that people understand what observability even is. They know what monitoring is, but what is the difference between observability and monitoring? What does that mean? And what is the current state of management in IT from your perspective?
Yeah, another great question. Regarding cars, flying cars, I haven't seen any. So if you encounter one, let me know. Regarding, taking a step backwards into monitoring, plain simple monitoring, metrics, logs, this was the most basic form out of it. But then application became more complex. Just looking at the CPU or memory or number of, requests, like read metrics or something similar, it's just not enough anymore. So observability, it has a lot of, debating what exactly is each one, pulls the strings to a different direction. But ultimately, it's a more mature approach than, just looking at tons of charts and, trying to understand, is the database okay? Is my cluster okay? Is the application okay? Something that really helps you get through the charts into the actual, let's call it application orchestration level, and really understand what going on from end to end. So one example that we're really putting into focus in our solution is around the distributed tracing capabilities, being able to look at a request as it propagates through different services, different codes, different nodes, different resources, calls to Redis, Mongo, Kafka, or whatever solution that you're using, being able to have everything under the same dashboard while, this kind of the overall observability and what I'm thinking, the drive to that is 2 points. One of them, reducing the, you can call it whatever, mean time to response, mean time to detect. So once there is a problem, getting into the root cause is very simple. So this is one KPI for observability that I'm usually working with organizations. Today it can take hours or days. We help them minimize this into minutes or, no more than an hour. The second one is development velocity. So a good observability approach impacts not only production, but also development. Because, think of it, any engineer out there experiencing the same thing over and over with new features. What it is, designing, implementation, testing, and going to production. And with such complex ecosystems, you need to, again, not monitor, but observe. You need to understand how your new service integrating with the rest of the microservices, whether it's the right performance, whether, the testing are running right and the business logic works as expected. So this is the second parameter, how fast you're going to market, or what's your development velocity that can be measured in several ways. So the last part of your question, I don't think that IT work, turned into zero. It just changed over the years. If traditional IT work, and there's also a debate, IT/DevOps, like who's owning the new part now. But if it used to be networking level, if it used to be hosting level, more platform wise, now it's more orchestration level and providing the right set of tools for engineers to move forward with implementation. So I hope that's kind of target your question.
Great. Hey, Kendall, let me follow up with you on that. Historically, anytime there was an issue, you basically shoved everybody in a war room and locked the door until somebody could prove their innocence, and then you let them out of the room. Is that metaphor, are we getting past that with observability? Do you think we're going to get down to the point now where we can be more proactive about things and discover things before they become an issue? Or is it always going to be, the crisis of the moment?
I mean, if anything, if observability is done right, it enables blameful postmortems. You'll be able to point exactly at where the problem is. That you have blameless postmortems because of a cultural decision, not because you don't know where it came from. But I do think that configuration validation is going to be something we're going to see increasingly. And the interesting thing about Kubernetes landing as a single way to manage compute is that across clouds, there is right ways to configure Kubernetes within some boundaries. There are opinions that can be made. There are best practices. There are security best practices. There are up-to-date CVEs, et cetera, that are unique to Kubernetes, where previously anything cloud, you couldn't really say, hey, this is the right way to do it, because if you were using Elastic Beanstalk, it was different than Google App Engine, right? But by Kubernetes becoming this default that people are landing on, we're going to see tools around the configuration validation space to avoid those problems, because security is always a buzzword and security depends on good configuration. The vast majority of security problems don't come from just somebody hacking in and testing everything until they find a loophole. But even if that is the case, the way they find the loophole is somebody misconfigured something. The vast majority of security incidents are relatively easy to avoid if you just get configuration right. So yes, we're going to see more and more things go down that rabbit hole. Observability, I think, is going to be married increasingly with that configuration validation. Like, it's one thing to make aware what's going on, what's going wrong, but I think that there's this other market of how can we avoid things going wrong? Is this configured right? And it's really difficult to be highly opinionated about those things in a cloud world where everybody's using all kinds of different things, but it's pretty easy in a cloud world where people are increasingly using Kubernetes, or even Kubernetes is what's running under the hood, even if it's not obvious to the person using it. And that helps nail down some of that. Does that answer your question, Mike?
It does. Jimmy, since Kendall brought up this security topic, is security it feels like it's being bolted on to Kubernetes again. It feels like it's riding on the caboose and the engine, and we're doing the same thing we always do. From your perspective, are things getting better with Kubernetes and security, or is it pretty much just a different type of insecurity that we're seeing, and it's just the same old thing all over again?
Yeah, so I think honestly that IT industry has a way of repeating itself. Even going back to mainframe, to virtualization, to where we're at in Kubernetes, right? If you look at it, it's all different ways of doing the same exact thing. So I believe that we do repeat history when it comes to the lack of security. So normally, when there is a new offering, something like this, like Kubernetes, right? We go and implement without, well, security comes later. And while natively it is pretty secure, there's still very big flaws around specific things, right? Anything can be hacked, anything can be misconfigured. The key is to make sure that you want to avoid having manual interactions, right? So if you have somebody manually provisioning clusters, manually deploying applications, right? Human error comes into play there. You want to have a standardized configuration for your infrastructure, your standardized application deployment, right? And all of that kind of comes with the security and governance that you can apply to these clusters. We have several different standards for each industry that's out there, right? So you talk about HIPAA, you talk about PCI, you talk about SOX, you could talk about NIST, right? They all have different security standards that have been built around data centers, right, for specific areas of the industry globally. And you do want to adhere to those, even in this new Kubernetes world. You want to kind of get as close. There are standards that are being written today that kind of favor, that kind of look at all of the Kubernetes space and how some of those standards that existed for many, many years kind of fit into the industry today. So I think you cannot have one without the other, especially if you're looking at doing it at a scale in a production type of environment. In development, you could kind of get away with it. It's still not recommended, but when it comes to production, you need to make sure that your security standards are applied, your configuration standards are applied, and they're enforced. Otherwise, you're not going to be in for a good time.
All right, folks, we are talking about Kubernetes on the devops.com site. So let's shift gears a little bit because we do have some questions around methodologies. And Jimmy, I'm going to throw this one back at you as well. But we have a first question here is like, how do I get from where I am today to where I'm going tomorrow? A lot of people have these monolithic platforms. They're using waterfall methodologies. And now at the very back end of that, or the extreme, people are also talking about GitOps as a flavor of DevOps. And it seems like Kubernetes and GitOps are being joined at the hip. So what's your sense of where are we on the application development and deployment lifecycle, and how do I get from here to there?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see that shift into a more of a GitOps approach. I think developers, if you've been a developer, and working with application development of any kind, even in Linux or virtual machines or anything like that, you have lived in the GitOps world. You have developed your application there, you have pushed your code there, right? You have made changes through there. I think it's no different. Right now, we are switching into the Kubernetes world, and just because it's a different type of work where your workload is going to execute and run, I think the GitOps methodology is still very much valid, and it's a good way of being able to deploy consistently applications at a scale. Otherwise, if you do not follow those GitOps best practices, and it becomes kind of like a wild, wild west. You can be having folks pushing code into your application, and if it's not checked in properly to a proper GitOps process, right, you're going to have a bad time. So I personally think that the methodology around GitOps and application deployment around GitOps, it is still very much important. As a matter of fact, you'll see several projects coming out that kind of support this methodology. Argo CD is one of them that just comes to mind, right? Of being able to have that GitOps mentality behind your application deployments. I think it's something that you absolutely need to think about when you're doing your planning. You need to consult with your developers, understand what they're doing today, and if they're not working on a GitOps type of methodology, even with your native application deployment in Linux or virtual machines, you need to heavily look into that, because otherwise, your deployments are just not going to be consistent, especially in a production type of environment.
Ron, do you agree with that? I mean, an artifact is an artifact, whether I'm going to deploy it in a monolithic or microservices world, and I just need to figure out how to manage this. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Also on my end, to some extent, that's what I agree. I just wanted to add also on Jimmy, taking an organization from monolithic application to microservices, that's quite, a wild ride to get there. And what I've seen so far working the best way is the strangler approach, the strangler pattern. So assuming you have quite a big monolithic application serving different purposes, one-stop shop that literally acts as a, beast that is doing everything, billing and account management and business logic 1, 2, 3, and authentication. So the strangler pattern really describes a way to start and, ripping parts from the monolithic application to microservices. So, taking, for example, the authentication service or management out to a microservice that now it communicates back to the monolithic application, then ripping another one, and in the meantime, implementing new services on, the best practices. So on top of what Jimmy said, I think this is a good strategy, literally moving from a monolithic to microservices. That's alongside with, Adriano that asked this, going from waterfall to agile, methodologies for development.
All right. I think what you just said was, if you attempt to boil the ocean, you will surely drown, right?
Or you'll boil with it. The thing that I would add to this is just service ownership. The mature organizations are getting there, and what that means is your developer is enabled to push code through the different environments, testing, staging, whatever, into production, has the tools enabled to both push in there with least privileged access, probably through a CI pipeline, as well as has the monitoring tools in place to know how the application is performing, as well as has the alerting tools in place so that they're the ones woken up at midnight if the service goes down. They can see what the problem is and they can respond accordingly. Now, the piece that often gets missed from that is they need to be blocked on their deployments if they're pushing things that are insecure into the cluster. And that's something that's easy for organizations to miss. They just want to enable the service to be pushed and be up, but then the developer is going to wildly over provision it so that they don't get woken up, because they don't want to have to worry about scaling. And so getting the sizing right, the security right, all of those bits and good tools enable service ownership. But so many organizations out there still have a development team that pushes to some kind of gatekeeping operations team that makes sure everything works before they push it into production. And that's not DevOps. That's an old-fashioned sysadmin team with a single gatekeeping key holder. And the tools exist out there to really enable service ownership. And I'll say it again: service ownership. And is GitOps a part of that? Sure, but get there, and Kubernetes makes it possible and makes it easy, and you can cordon things off and give people the right access. But that's the way you peel off a monolith is not giving an ops team or a development team, here's a huge application, good luck everybody, right? But it's setting in place patterns that every team can then peel off and say, we know what we're supposed to do. Here's the API we need to interact with. We know how to do that. We're developers. We do APIs, right? And then they figure out how to push pieces in. They figure out a pattern to repeat, and that monolith slowly gets broken into the pieces that actually make sense. And it is doable, but it's messy. So we lost Rand.
Jimmy, are you seeing that? Because, Red Hat is affiliated with a company that is maybe closely associated with a lot of monoliths. So,
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, we are. We are. And the point that Kendall brought up around, being able to have all your services in place and make sure that, you kind of simplify it, right? It's important. It's a very, 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 very important point. You got to think about this. The more complicated you make the application deployment for your developers, the less your developers will work on that application. You have to also make sure that you make it nice and easy for them to interact with all these different tools. Developers, we talked about APIs, right? Developers don't like GUIs. They like APIs. They like to just, from their laptop, from a command prompt, they like to interact with every single tool that exists across the organization, right? So, you want to make sure that when you are working with your developers to set up all these tools along the way to do the application deployment end to end, you want to make sure that you don't over pivot. You want to make sure that you stay within the boundaries of making it, enabling the developer to kind of do their work more efficient. Efficiency is key here. If you're not enabling them to be efficient with their application deployment, they're just simply not going to care about their application. As simple as that. I mean, I've seen it in several different organizations, right? The more red tape you add along the way, the worse it is. So you got to be careful. There is a such thing as a balance here to make sure that when you are implementing all the different tools along the way, that number one, that they talk and interact with each other through some kind of API. I mean, that's a basic thing. And number two, that whatever they might interact along the way, there's nothing that stops that developer from moving forward, right? If there's a lot of red tape along the way, they will stop. They will just halt.
All right. Hey, Kendall, I want to get your opinion on this whole conversation that's going on about stateful apps and containers and stateless apps. And in some ways, it's a little bit of a shaky debate because I'm not sure there is such a thing as a stateless app. Somewhere along the line, data gets stored somewhere. But there are a lot of efforts to maybe bring the stateful nature or the persistent storage into the Kubernetes cluster itself. What are the challenges that go with that? Are we going to converge the management of compute and storage as a result of that? What are you seeing?
Oh gosh, there's so much to say on this. I mean, first of all, I know some people that want to run their database or their stateful data inside of Kubernetes because they want that promise of cloud portability so that they can go to AWS and say, "We don't like you, we're going to move to Google." And that's a dream, that's a myth. Don't do that and try to pull that lever because it turns out Amazon has you, and you think you can get away, but you can't. And like, it's not worth it, first of all. So don't do it for that reason. Also, like, there's the other problem of if you're running it inside your Kubernetes cluster, you're managing it yourself. And when it comes to data, don't manage it yourself. RDS exists for a reason. Cloud SQL exists for a reason. Whatever. Use a third party, Percona, if you need to. But if you can dump your data on somebody else and make it their problem to manage sharding as it gets bigger, manage backups as you have problems, et cetera, like, do that, because data is a big, hairy problem that is probably not your business's core business need. So moving it into Kubernetes in some sense means now you have to manage it. And just as a general rule, don't manage your own data if you can avoid it. So that's one reason. The next thing is that Kubernetes does have the ability, in theory, to have persistent state run in the cluster. But if you need to, we push everybody to have everything as infrastructure as code, all the way down to, a most basic DR plan is you tear everything down and stand everything back up, right? And if that data is running in some third-party database, you tear down the clusters, you stand everything back up, and it just reconnects to the database, and you're good to go. In theory, you can disconnect that database as a persistent volume and stand up a new Kubernetes cluster and reconnect it, but then you have race conditions and all kinds of other problems that can happen. And there are reasons to run persistent data in Kubernetes. Most people's are not good enough reasons to do so. And now there's lots of folks who are running small bits here or there, but the cloud is ephemeral. It's going to come, it's going to go. Amazon's going to turn off your instance at some point, and if you're using Kubernetes, Kubernetes is going to turn it off at some point. And so you need to count on things being ephemeral always, 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 always. with an asterisk. There are appropriate exceptions under certain conditions. So is there a way, is there a time, is there a place to run persistent data in Kubernetes? Sure. As a general rule, put your data somewhere else. Kubernetes is built to be ephemeral all the way down to the cluster level. And don't count on your data sticking around forever there. You can do it. It's just messy, and you don't want your data to be messy, ever.
Jimmy, you guys agree with that? I mean, IBM and Red Hat have significant storage portfolios. So where do you see the intersection?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that statement. I think we do have several things within the portfolio that allows you to kind of manage your data in a non-ephemeral way. But I think it's something that regardless you should, just because again, this is just what people need to remember is that while this is a new technology to some, if you really think about it, this is very similar to what we used to do in mainframes or even virtualization, right? The concepts are exactly the same. Just because we have a new way of presenting them doesn't mean that those main concepts still don't just completely go away and vanish. So definitely make sure that you plan out. I think what Kendall said is correct. To make sure that you plan out, to make sure that if you are going with a public cloud, you're going to be married to that public cloud for the foreseeable future. I mean, it's just the way it is. There's no tool in the market that will tell you, they might make you promises, but there's no tool that exists today that say, oh, I can take all your workloads, no problem, and move them over here, right? I mean, there are ways of doing certain things like that, but it's a promise still. So just make sure that you look at all of that when you're setting up your environments. I completely agree. I think it's not something that that should be look in any other different way.
All right, I want to get your opinion on the following. That's a different infrastructure conversation, but it maybe has the same kind of split opinion. Should I deploy Kubernetes on bare metal, or do I put it on these virtual machines that, if I go to Amazon, they're going to tell me I got to run it on a VM? What is the merits of putting Kubernetes on a VM versus bare metal?
So I'll take that one. I mean, that it really depends. I think there are use cases where having Kubernetes on bare metal is valid. One of them being telco, for example. Telco on a remote location, right, or completely disconnected. There is a valid use case there for having Kubernetes in a bare metal situation. Now, having it on a virtualization platform, right? Whatever that might be an existing platform that you have today or a public one that exists. Again, you need to just make sure that you think, how you're going to get there, number one. Number two, what is your application availability going to look like if you are going into a public one, if you're going into a virtualization type of environment, right? How quickly can you scale it out? The biggest problems that comes with Kubernetes is that folks underscale the Kubernetes clusters because they feel like the Kubernetes clusters are going to be enough to run their workloads because that's kind of like what they did in virtualization, right? And that might not be necessarily the case. Remember, while it is possible to be able to scale your clusters very quickly, it comes with complications at times as well. So you just want to make sure that whatever you decide, I think there is a valid use case for either or. There really is. You just need to make sure whatever industry you might be in and what your application is going to support, and then analyze that and then work your way backwards, right? If it makes sense, some of it might be in bare metal. If it makes sense, some of it might be in virtualization. It really depends.
All right. Hey, Ron, I want to ask you something. I believe that one of the benefits of moving to Kubernetes is that ultimately my costs will come down because I can more efficiently use my infrastructure. But on the other side of this coin, we've heard our panelists discuss how, the surest way to keep applications available is to throw as much infrastructure as you can at it, regardless of cost. So how do I strike a balance between cost and availability? And what's your best advice on this?
Yeah. I don't think that if you're moving to Kubernetes, the best advice would be, do it for cost reduction. That's probably the least reason to move to Kubernetes. Total cost of ownership, probably it might be even higher. I haven't measured it one-to-one, but that's definitely not a good reason. It do, however, opens or unlocks several ways to improve your availability or resiliency in several ways, let alone being able to ship software faster or ship at least, time to market of specific areas in your application much faster. So I wouldn't say that there is a trade-off between, there's always a trade-off between cost and resiliency, but I don't think that Kubernetes changed it. Like, you want more resiliency, you want more availability, pay for it. I'm not sure if Kubernetes will be cheaper or more expensive than just having VMs or something similar. That's what I see from my end.
Well, I would argue a lot of the people that we see move to Kubernetes are on something like Heroku, and Heroku gets very expensive at a certain scale.
Yeah.
And so like if you're moving for that reason and it's to have control over that, and you're Kelsey Hightower said everybody wants a PaaS, they just want a PaaS they built themselves, right? That's Kubernetes is the closest thing we have to a PaaS framework kind of right now. And we see a lot of people moving, and in that move, save 50% on their infrastructure. So, depending on what they're at, but there's a lot of indirect costs, and I'm seeing somebody comment on that. I mean, first of all, Fairwinds has an open source tool called Goldilocks that helps you get your resource requests just right, and it leverages something under the hood, with Kubernetes, the vertical pod autoscaler that everybody's bad at using, and makes it a little bit easier to use. So if you want an open source tool, go look at that. Our software also has a whole bunch of logic in it around specifically getting cost right, because there is some promise that you can get your workloads, in Kubernetes, you can make your cost very closely match your actual usage. And that's part of the promise for sure. So if you have the right tooling to expose that, and I'm sure there's other things out there that do something similar. But
also cost prediction is very hard, especially when you're doing real dynamic scaling, things going up and down, different servers, different instance types. So I would say for the benefit of VMs, the prediction is very easy. You control very fine-grained what you're putting on and off. And while with Kubernetes, especially things like Heroku, which I love, but setting up dynos, it's a nice way to tell Heroku, get more of my money, or I'm giving you the flexibility to get more of my money, depends on your logic. So cost visibility is also a topic that, especially combining with cloud, Kubernetes, potentially serverless, is getting very, very hard nowadays.
All right. Hey, Jimmy, does freedom and agility come at a cost then? And, how do I balance my interest in making my developers more productive, deploying faster? I mean, what's the ROI on that, and how do I measure that versus the cost and there's a certain amount of headache that goes with Kubernetes. So how do I balance those two things?
Yes, that's a tough one, right? Just speaking on costs alone of infrastructure is really not the full picture, right? You need to understand also how much your costs are per developer that are building applications, right? So, I mean, I think this is something that I think the industry is still kind of trying to solve for. It's not an easy task to kind of solve for this, because you need to understand, how much that developer is costing you, how productive that developer is, right? The infrastructure that developer requires for the application, right? And sometimes, like Kendall and both Rand said, being able to understand very easily is not cookie cutter. You cannot find a way to just be able to tell for sure how much your costs are, right? So, when it comes to like being able to free yourself and like make sure that your costs stay within proper, it's a little bit difficult. You just there's a lot of planning involved. There are tools out there that can help, but there's also a lot of planning involved when it comes to that. So I think planning is key when it comes to being able to do that.
Well, and I would just add to that, there's the additional problem of, as good as I think the logic is that we've built even into our software for cost planning, all it takes is one customer who has massive spikes every Friday night from 5 to 7 p.m. and the rest of the week is really low. And like, you have to know your own scaling events in addition to all the things that we can tell you, because an average only does so much when your workloads do this and your workloads do that. And it's one thing to be, e-commerce and have a really spiky thing 3 days a year around Black Friday. It's another thing to be a company who, once every 3 weeks has 4 days of chaos. And there's all kinds of companies out there with all kinds of weird spiky behavior that they know about, and getting that all right and finely tuned and scaling as fast as you want it to scale. And it's all doable. You just got to know what you're doing.
Yeah, and you got to have good communication across your teams, right? Like I said earlier, you can have the best tools in the world, but if you don't have processes that follow and build around these tools, the tool becomes useless, right? Because like you talked about, you might have an organizational spike on Fridays, but if nobody knows that other than the IT operations team, then your software can't predict it properly. So.
All right. Well, Kendall, I want to get your opinion about this subject. You can't swing a cat these days without hitting somebody talking about AI. So is AI going to solve all our issues here around management? I mean, how automated can things get?
First of all, I'm swinging very few cats, Mike. I don't know where we are, what we're missing in terms of our social circles here. But the thing is first of all, the vast majority of the automation is just going to be algorithms. It's not even going to be AI. Is AI going to solve some of these problems? Yes. I've seen a few companies out there who are building AI-based cost management for Kubernetes. And to quote a VP of engineering that's a customer of ours, no way in, bleep would I trust an AI company with 100% managing my cost and my resource requests and my scaling events. Like, no way. And maybe someday AI is going to get good enough that people start to trust those things. The vast majority of AI isn't AI. It's just an algorithm. Algorithms are great. Is real AI going to come along and solve some of these problems? Probably eventually, but we're not far enough along for most of us to be very impressed by it yet.
Yeah. All right. Hey, Ron, you want to add to that? Because, observability is the path.
Yeah, I heard it, if-else statements, if you combining many of these, it also can be a good AI to detect some patterns. So I think there's just, it's being overrated. We're not there yet. It's definitely the future. Maybe, again, I'm just speculating, but maybe in 5 years we'll be in a good position to trust, some algorithms to point us to, what's the problem? Where is the problem? What's the right configuration? What's the right set? I don't think neither the world or the ecosystem of Kubernetes nor the ecosystem of the tooling and the AI algorithms fitted for this job are mature enough to, or even adopted enough to make us be confident when some random solution tells you change your configuration here and you'll save 20% out of your cost, or there is a spike here and this is very important as I find it. Many of these become, false positives or just noise or just, it's not there yet. That's what I'm trying to say.
All right. Hey, guys, we're getting close to the end. And I got to announce our winners here, but I want to thank everybody for being on the show because it's always a pleasure to be on one of these things where I have the least amount of intelligence in the room. So thank you guys for being here. Our winners are on the Amazon gift certificate, Jocelyn H., Rob T., Adriana S., and Dwayne E. You'll be getting those shortly from us. Again, I want to thank everybody for spending your time with us today. I hope you learned a few things because I sure did. And as always, Kubernetes, it's an adventure. It's the most powerful thing that probably come down the pike in a long time. And as such, it comes with great responsibilities. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Mm.